Welcome to We Build Great Apartment Communities, the only show dedicated to the process and strategies for transforming apartment buildings to thriving communities. I am your host, John Brackett, and welcome to the show. All right, folks, welcome to another amazing episode of We Build Great Apartment Communities, the only place where you can come to learn how to take apartment buildings and turn them into amazing communities. So I am your host, John Brackett. I have another great guest here. His name is Scott Smith. And Scott is an asset protection attorney and also an investor, which is why he's on this show. So it's one thing to have a conversation with an attorney. And I know a lot of us have had at this point probably hundreds of conversations with attorneys, but it's another to have a conversation with an attorney who is also investing and underwriting and looking at opportunities and investments the same way that we are. So this is going to be a treat today. Going to be a very unique conversation, also provide multiple perspectives from the lens of not only an attorney, but also someone who is investing as well and has invested in various asset classes throughout the nation. So Scott, welcome to the show, bud.
Hey, thanks, John. Great to be here. I always love coming on shows like this because it's my pleasure to teach about everything I know about. I started helping people with asset protection. One, because these are the same challenges I had to come across being a real estate investor myself. And also because I had a friend of mine who lost, over $3 million from a single lawsuit. And if he would have just taken those simple precautions along the way and actually doing some forethought and planning with his tax and his estate planning and his asset protection, he wouldn't have lost that money. And it was a pretty big setback for him. So yeah, I'm an open book for you. Happy to share about my experience and what we see, the over 2,000 clients that work with me in Royal Legal Solutions, doing around the country as best practice.
Okay, awesome. I really appreciate that. Hey, so let's maybe start with you explaining what asset protection is, right? From the viewpoint of an investor. And so, you were kind enough to give an example of your friend and some of the challenges that he or she ran into because of maybe not necessarily implementing some of the strategies that he or she has likely done today. So if you can start with, maybe a general summary of what that is and how you describe that, and then we'll start moving into some of the details.
Yeah. Asset protection is essentially like lawsuit protection, right? So we think about the ways you can lose money in real estate. You can make a bad deal, right? Because you didn't price things out correctly. You could have an accident on your property, and hopefully in that scenario, like your insurance would cover you either partially or completely. But then asset protection treats all the other things that insurance wouldn't cover, right? A lot of people think insurance is there and protects them 100%, even though it's a profit-seeking corporation. I used to sue insurance companies as part of my litigation practice as an attorney. And I can tell you that they only pay out what they have to pay out to people, right? So they'll cover the small claims, but not the big claims that come through. And if you don't have asset protection, the proper LLCs and trusts put in place to protect yourself from those lawsuits, what it means is that you potentially have everything that you own at risk. So you have to have asset protection and the proper LLC and trust structures put in place to ensure that if there's a lawsuit, if for any reason that the insurance company either denies the coverage or just doesn't cover it because insurance overly covers simple accidents. If it's a breach of contract claim or environmental claim or any other type of claim in there, they won't cover it. And without the asset protection being put in place, then all of a sudden now people can come after you for everything that you own, which is a really scary and horrible place to be. And it actually happens all the time.
Interesting. So let's back up a little bit. So I appreciate you explaining that, Scott. I think maybe to give some further context to this conversation, can you talk a little bit about how you got started and how you started getting exposed to real estate investments, what you have invested in and what you're invested in now?
Yeah, so I actually got started when I was in law school. I bought a transmission and auto repair shop and rehabbed the building and the business to flip it to graduate from law school without any debt. And then after that, I went into practice suing insurance companies because that's what they do, right? They collect premiums and they deny coverage. I mean, that's the business model if you're in insurance, right? So I sued them for a couple of years and then I was working for a firm, and with all the extra money that I would have from my paychecks, I would keep putting that money back into more real estate deals. So pretty soon I was making more money doing real estate than I was being an attorney. So I left being an attorney and just did real estate full time. And then I ran into a lot of the problems that a lot of my clients have now, right? Which is, okay, great. Well, I'm good at buying the asset, but now what about all the other stuff? How am I doing my strategic tax planning? And how am I looking at my estate planning to make sure all these assets actually pass to my family appropriately? How do I make sure that I'm protected from lawsuits because I understand that tenants could sue me or that people could sue me for a breach of contract or that a contractor could sue me? And how do I make sure that they can't touch my assets? What happens in the scenario that I don't want people to know everything that I own? So how do I hide my assets from the public records? That way I don't get those annoying marketing text messages from people.
Yeah.
And I also, people looking into me don't know how much I own or what are all the extent of the assets that I have. So my experience is really stretched from everything from single family homes to apartment complexes to commercial buildings to land to notes. And we bring all of that experience inside of what our core competencies in Royal Legal Solutions is that we specialize in just, these core areas, the tax estate planning and asset protection just solely for real estate investors. And that's kind of how the whole thing was born, was just out of my own experience of being an investor and then looking at, well, great, well, now how can we help people all over the country? And now we're a team of about 30, number of paralegals and attorneys helping clients all across the country.
Awesome. Hey, so what a great way to start in the insurance space, right? Because it gives you a lot of perspective around things that are working and things that don't work. What was one of the biggest lessons that you took away from working with insurance companies that you were able to map over to your practice today? Because, insurance, depending on the state that you're in, is one of the next to likely, property taxes, depending on the state, is one of the largest line items on a P&L, right? On an operating statement. So it's an expense that we have to pay for not only the lender, but for our own protection as an investor. And so making sure that that's, properly underwritten and we have the right insurances in place is very, very important. But what were some of the things that you saw there that you're able to apply to your practice today that really adds as a value add based on those experiences?
Yeah. So the first thing is like, where is insurance actually really helpful? So insurance is actually really helpful in anything that's like really simple accidents that happen, like somebody slips and falls on your property, something like that. Your insurance company will come in and defend you from that lawsuit and, pay out whatever settlement that they're able to negotiate out on your behalf, right? The
Right.
problem is like anything else that happens, right? So if it's a really bad accident, all of a sudden the insurance company can say they're not responsible for it because it's an accident that was really bad. It's called gross negligence, right? So, and they'll say that's something you should have known was going to happen, and therefore we're not going to cover it. And they're the ones that get to make that decision, right? So that's the bad side of insurance. Or if it's a breach of contract claim that somebody says, hey, you owe me money because of you breached your requirements of the lease, or that contractor says, hey, I did this work on this property and now I'm going to sue because of a breach of contract issue. The bad part of insurance is that it's not wholly protective, right? And especially it's not wholly protective whenever anything really bad happens, right? Like if somebody dies on the property or has like grandma falls through the staircase and ends up permanently injured, just some of these things that can happen that they don't happen all the time. But we know statistically that real estate investors have over a 90% chance of being sued during their lifetime of being a real estate investor with a major lawsuit, right? So, and when we look at over that 15 to 20-year time period, we know that a major lawsuit is going to happen. The only question is how prepared are we going to be whenever it does happen? And then from my position, I look at it and say the most prepared we can be is having these legal issues, I's dotted and T's crossed, to make it where we're the insurance company would cover us. Even if they don't, we fall back on our entity structure and that we know our entity structure is going to work. And it only works if we're proactive about putting it together. So we should have insurance. I firmly believe in all of us being very well insured, but just not relying on insurance to fully protect ourselves. To go from that 80 to 100%, you have to have entity structures in place.
And so, what would be one of the common risks that you see, or what would be one of the more common claims that you see submitted, right, in the space that we're in and either get paid out or not get paid out for that matter?
With at Royal Legal Solutions, what we specialize in is how to create the castles of protection using anonymity trusts and LLCs and other entities to make it so difficult to come after any one of our clients that we just see lawsuits just getting dropped at the very beginning of litigation because they look at it and they're like, oh man, I don't want to have to fight through this castle of protection. It's going to be really expensive for me to go after this guy. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. I'm just not going to do it. And that's because what we understand is something really different than what most people understand. We understand that lawsuits are actually a business. And all we have to do is make it where we put all the legal protections in place ahead of time to make it a bad business decision for somebody to go after one of our clients.
Hey,
That's all I have to do.
Scott. I really like that. That's really wise. I like how you articulated that.
Yeah, thanks, John.
So at some point, though, there has to be this break even, right? Where the benefit of doing what you just described, putting these protections in place, outweighs the cost in many cases by a lot, right? Because putting that kind of structure in place and then maintaining that forward I'm sure is not free and usually, has expense associated with that. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? And then I'm going to start breaking this down the way that you described around what you talked about, the strategic tax planning, the estate planning, and then the asset protection, and we'll kind of bring all this stuff together. But if you can talk a little bit about that, then we'll pivot and start, segmenting this out.
Cool. Yeah. So, the first idea I think that you addressed, John, was like what types of claims or what types of issues can you run into from a legal perspective? Right. The reality is you actually can't control that, right? You can get all types of different legal claims, from gross negligence for people getting hurt on your property. I've had some clients that had property, got into a really bad car accident, and then people started trying to pursue them with all of the other assets they held in their personal name, in their banking accounts, stock accounts, et cetera, because they still had all these assets in their personal name. They're clients of ours, but only in a limited capacity, right? They didn't really listen to the full instruction we were giving them, which is you need to have all of your assets out of your personal name to be able to protect yourself, because you can't control what the facts are and you can't control what the lawsuit's going to be. It doesn't even matter if you're honest. People can sue you anyway, and they'll just lie about everything else. So you can only do the things to say, like, tend like everybody else in the world is out to get you, and operate from that perspective of what can they do. So when we look at like what the costs are and associated with the benefits, there's definitely cost benefit analysis to be done here, right? But the reality of the situation is, and when you look at your overall cost of what it is that you can put in place, those are always scalable to whatever level you're at. So we have some clients that'll come in and they'll spend less than $1,000 with us to be able to do like a really basic like LLC structure, but they want to make sure that it's done right and that it fits inside of this overarching plan of where they're going to grow, which is our specialty. Is like, how do we get people to a place where they can really see scalable systems with their real estate and their tax and their legal? What I can tell you though is that even the clients that come in and spend 5, 10, 15, 25, up to $50,000 with us in some cases, if we're doing a lot of offshore planning and they're much higher net worth, and so it makes sense for us to spend that kind of money. The majority of our clients usually spend somewhere between $1,000 and $10,000, I'd say, is the cost of one lawsuit. That if you could stop one lawsuit from going against you, that the amount of money that you spend on asset protection is always less than just your attorney's fees in defending yourself from a lawsuit. So my philosophy is you spend the money on protection to stop the lawsuits before they ever start, because that's where we've seen that we have a lot of strength actually, is putting together in all of this infrastructure and the anonymity and the protection that stops the lawsuits before they start, instead of hoping you never get sued and then having to spend all of that money on attorney's fees. And by the way, you're not protected. So that way, whatever way that lawsuit goes, you might pay all that in attorney's fees plus a big judgment. So just spend the money up front, have it as an investment, build the infrastructure correctly.
Okay, good. So I am in total agreement with that, right? I mean, I'm in total agreement that what I have seen, especially in my own structures, is depending on the state, if I have, for example, 10 LLCs in the state of California, and every year I have to pay, $800 irrespective of what's going on in that LLC, it can get pretty costly. And so that's something that I've had to reevaluate over the years. But I understand what you're saying. I'd rather pay for the consulting up front, the advice up front, especially if it's good advice, right? Put in place the right structure. But, from an operating standpoint forward, I know the structure can be expensive. And so I think it's really important, depending on the state that you're in, to really understand what that looks like, because the operating cost to carry that on an annual basis, at least for me, has gotten pretty expensive. So I had to reevaluate some of that. Okay, so I appreciate you explaining that. Let's talk a little bit about, and I always have a challenge pronouncing this, anonymity. Did I say that right? Keeping everything private, right? So you want to keep it private. Yeah, I ran into an issue with this recently, no more than 30 days ago, okay, where something really small, we got tagged. It was a small claim. We got something that really wasn't associated with us that we didn't know, but we got pulled into this thing. And it was really small. It was something like, maybe $1,500 or $2,000. But the issue was this. They named us as trustees, and it just kind of went on down the line, right? Over a really small amount of $2,000. Now, the challenge was, okay, that small amount, if that went into collections, because we're so, I don't want to say dependent on credit, but because we're in the real estate business and credit is so important to us, my FICO is very strong, it could have really hurt us, right? So that's when I said, you know what, this is crazy. I got to find a way to fix this. So I completely understand when you said, hey, keeping things private. Let's start with that first, right? The estate planning side of this. Okay. And then we'll move into asset protection, and then we'll move into some tax strategy. But I think this is really important because, the more you start to amass and put together, I think, keeping things private becomes a lot more important, especially for us because we're private people anyway. But this was something that really opened my eyes. So can you talk a little bit about that, Scott?
A couple of things, John, from your story that you just shared, right? There was like, hey, well, I actually ended up having to pay out money, and I was actually in a disadvantageous position negotiating what to do in this lawsuit because like eventually they could hurt my credit score. This is 100% of the reason why I think everybody should operate through an LLC. That if you're doing business inside of your personal name in any capacity, you're making a huge mistake, whether it's owning assets in your personal name or doing business in your personal name, because either one of those two things, if it allow people to have extreme amounts of leverage over you, if things go wrong. And the whole point of asset protection is to keep people from having leverage over you, right? And so that's why you need to do that analysis. And the only way to do that is to go through like a consultation and actually do that analysis, right? As to say, well, what are my true risks and what are the costs and the benefits that go along with that? Part of it, when we look at like saying, where does anonymity bias, is that with LLCs, right, as you typically would form them maybe through like your CPA or something else, or if you just decided to do it on LegalZoom, right? With those entity structures, all of your public information is disclosed as you just being the owner and the control of those entities, what all those entities connect to, and what assets they own are all part of public records typically because you've deeded those assets directly into the name of those LLCs.
Right.
So people can really quickly find out what are the extent of assets that they can pursue. Their ability to get after those assets, that's a different legal question, right? It's like, can they pierce your LLC because you haven't maintained it correctly or done something else there? But when you know that there's a big pot of gold, and if you're, a litigation attorney out there, the moment you can see a big pot of gold, you start going to Vegas. You start rolling some dice and spending some money to see if you can probe some weakness in what somebody else has to know, like, hey, is this something that's good to attack? The better thing to do if you're on the defense side is to have everything anonymous. So that way it looks like you qualify for food stamps if anybody ever comes looking for you, because it doesn't look like you own anything. It doesn't look like you own any companies. It doesn't look like you own any assets. You look like you're a really bad target to come after from the business decision of filing a lawsuit. And you only get that with anonymity. So anonymity is how you stop the lawsuit before it ever gets filed. And then when you look at LLCs and other types of trust protection, is how if the lawsuit does get filed, you're able to get out of it very, very cheaply or just not have to pay anything at all.
Fortunately, I have never had to pay because we document everything so well that, to your point, people are like, man, this makes no sense to keep moving this forward. Let's go the other way. I totally understand, and I really appreciate the conversation. Okay, so I really appreciate what you said, and I appreciate the perspective around privacy and that being part of estate planning. Okay, now I'm going to come back to estate planning in a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about now asset protection. I know we kind of touched on that along the way to this point. Okay, but now can you talk a little bit about asset protection and then how that would relate to estate planning, right? So I'll give you an example. Let me explain this from the context of an investor. So, we roughly have 40% of our listeners, they're operators, the other 40%, they're passive investors, fairly experienced, and then roughly 20% are folks looking to get into this space, right? So from the perspective of an operator, asset protection, you talked about an LLC and some of the other structures. Can you explain that a little bit more in depth, Scott, and provide an example? I've always learned that examples, they carry over to our audience much better because typically people can understand that a little better. Maybe use the example of your colleague or your friend that lost $3 million. So if you can talk through that loss and then explain in hindsight what that person maybe should have done now with your expertise, that would be a great example of asset protection, right?
Yeah. So he ended up losing $3 million from a single lawsuit because he had all the properties held inside of his personal name. And so he had another deal that he was working on that he had signed a contract for, just like probably how most of us typically would if we didn't know any better. We signed that contract and say, great, well, I'm doing another deal, right? Well, what happened was that contract ended up falling through and litigation ended up arising from it. And because he had all of his assets in his personal name and he signed that other contract, well, one, the insurance doesn't protect you because insurance companies never protect you against any allegation of fraud. If somebody said that you defrauded them from an email that you sent, or that you, in this case, that you had breached a contract, you made promises that you didn't keep, right? Those are all things that insurance wouldn't protect you from, and they didn't protect him either. So then he ended up having to go through a litigation process and spend, I think it was around $30,000 to $50,000 in attorney's fees to ultimately lose really big, right? As it came to it. So he could have prevented all of that if he just would have had all of his assets held inside of an individual LLC. Then he wouldn't have had any personal assets, and they could have sued him all day long. The worst thing that they would have been able to do in that case is hurt his credit score. And if he wanted to do one, level of protection better than just having all of his assets inside an LLC, which is not the best way to hold all of your assets, by the way, but it's the easiest thing to do. If that's all you could afford to do or all you wanted to do, that's much better than holding it inside of your personal name. But he also could have done that other deal through an LLC that we would call an operating LLC, an LLC that doesn't own anything, but it does all of your operations. So that way that the lawsuit itself would have gone against that operating LLC. It couldn't have gone against him personally because he did the deal through the operating LLC. And it couldn't have gone after any of his assets because that's held in a completely separate LLC. So in that scenario, he could have set up two LLCs. He would have been 100% protected personally, and all of his assets would have been protected as well too. And he would have been operating just like rich people do. Rich people don't own things. They have LLCs that own things for them, right? And then they always operate through LLCs that don't own anything. So that way, if that LLC gets sued, they can just shut that LLC down and open up another one, right? And all I'm advocating for is saying, let's just do the basic principles that rich people have already charted the way on to say, like, that's the right way that you should grow wealth and do business.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think that's really wise. And I really love how you articulated that. So why an LLC versus an S corporation as an example?
Those are all just tax elections. So when you look at saying
pass through,
but you get do different tax election pieces of like with the S corporation with how you'd be doing splits, and that's more of like a tax strategy issue that comes with that, right? So on the asset protection side of things, we're really looking at LLCs and trusts, hide assets, protect them from litigation. Then inside of like the tax piece, that's where we're starting to make considerations of, okay, do we need an S corporation inside of the number of entities that we might have? We might want of these to be taxed as an S corporation because we want to take money out that way. I know some of my clients actually want to use C corporations because of different medical expenses they have, education expenses, but also because they say, well, I'll just hold the money in the C corp and then pay the 21% tax. I'm just never going to withdraw the money from the C corp. I'm just going to use it as an expense shelter and then to pay a lower tax rate. But that's the tax strategy side of like what can happen with your entity structuring, right? But for the very, very basics of what do most people need, it's like the very first place to start is let's just look at moving your assets from the worst place you can hold them, which is inside of your personal name, and getting in that into an LLC structure. And then let's look at taking your business operations that you're doing and getting that into a completely separate LLC to protect you personally. So that way people can't harm your credit score. And if we just accomplish that, you're at a much better place than most investors and just most people in this country.
Yeah, so I have many examples that I can talk through, but I probably don't want to do that online. I mean, literally, like a lot of examples, right? From estate planning with our trust and some issues that I run into with my estate planning attorney. And I think it's an issue of us outgrowing the person that we're with right now because we're literally talking through a lot of these, trying to find ways to mitigate them. And what I've realized is the more business you do, the more you need to work with people that are also doing a lot of transactions, meaning, attorneys or advisors, right? Because the complexity starts to change. And, you just get exposed to more, and those experiences, they translate into a little bit more wisdom that can then be shared on with clients, right? And so that was a big one. So you talking about this, I'm thinking, man, okay, here's like 4 different examples in my mind that come up. So I can completely relate. Okay, so I'm going to break up some of this stuff. You talked about an operating LLC, which, we do something fairly similar, and then a trust. So can you explain the difference between the use of an LLC and a trust, and then why one over the other? I think that would be a really good segue, and then we'll come back around and finish it off with a summary around tax strategy.
The typical things to think about here is like maybe there's 3 different types of like entities, right? You have your types of like revocable trusts that are like land trusts that we use just for anonymity purposes. Then we have our LLCs, which we're typically using for liability protection. So that way, if somebody sues you, they can't get anything you own. If somebody sues one of your properties, they can only take that one property. They can't take any of your other properties. And inside of that LLC spigot, you might consider using a series LLC, which is infinitely scalable for free. You can manage everything through one bank account. A lot of like cost savings and streamlining happens with using that series LLC. And then your third major option is using like a Delaware statutory trust, offshore trust, and other trust structures that provide anonymity and asset protection together. Those are your three major categories of the types of entities you'd use. And then what we do is we typically will stack them together in different ways to be able to accomplish different goals. So if we're using like LLCs, some clients say, well, hey, I just have the budget to be able to use just a traditional LLC here. And we say, great, well, let's start there. And then say, well, some clients will say, well, actually, I want to do the LLC, but I also want it to be anonymous. I don't want people to find out what LLCs I own, and I also don't want them to know what assets I own. Great. Well, now we need to layer in a trust structure with the LLC structure. The magic in these things, I correctly identified, John, is around not how any one particular piece of the puzzle works. It's how do all of the puzzle pieces work together, especially as you get bigger. So knowing that you have the right foundations to be able to scale off of with whatever the objectives you're trying to reach. And I think that's what's really unique about like what we do that's really different. And it's because we only specialize with just real estate investors that we can really talk about like, okay, here's foundational, here's how it scales, here's how it links together with all the other pieces of the puzzle. And you get to do that all in a one-stop shop with like one person to talk to instead of having to coordinate a bunch of different professionals that all have different levels of experience with your particular type of situation, which can, what we hear about is that that's really frustrating for people. And that's the problem we really solve.
Yeah, it can be fairly challenging, right? Trying to communicate across multiple different streams of professionals and then trying to relay that information back to the one person that actually has to write all the documents. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah. That's the way it works too. And a lot of these things have to be pretty flexible, right? Because what can be really great from an asset protection point of view might not make sense from a tax point of view.
Yeah.
And so then you're stuck having to do even harder things, which is basically have professionals argue with each other about which one you should go with, right? And so that's where we kind of stepped in and said, well, great, well, actually, we can line up that for everybody, from the start to the finish. And when it comes into the tax perspective, John, it's really actually really simple. The first thing that we're trying to do here is maximize our retirement account savings by using like solo 401k structures to give you that $57,000 a year to be able to use your tax deferred or tax free investing.
Sure.
And you go with that. The next things that we're looking to do is say, okay, well, if you're making over $50,000 a year, let's explore S corporation tax elections. So that way you can help avoid self-employment tax. You have to file an extra tax return, but you're going to avoid self-employment tax. If you're making over that $140,000, $130,000 a year-ish mark, that's when we start exploring like, okay, how are we going to use C corporations in conjunction with this to have additional write-offs and expense shelters and those kinds of things that come into it. So those are your three big numbers, it's 0 to 150, 150, 140, 140 plus, then it's a whole different game that we get into like at that realm. But if you don't have the basic setup with your retirement accounts, your S corporation, and up to your C corporation, those are the things that we would say everybody can win on. We know exactly how they'd win and can prove the impacts of that in very short order.
Okay, cool. So I appreciate the summary there. And I'm not going to get too much into leveraging retirement accounts as a tax strategy. And I understand the logic behind that. But what I do want to touch on a little bit, because there's a correlation, is the Delaware statutory trust and the Series LLC. Okay. So in California, for example, Series LLC not recognized yet. So how would you implement a strategy like that in a state? And what would be the risk of implementing that in a state where they still don't recognize the Series LLC? And so in a state like California, it would be hugely beneficial, right? Because of some of the franchise tax requirements at the end of the year. But what are your comments here? Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit and maybe an alternative?
Yeah, happy to do that. So the best thing for California investors to use is what's going to be called the Delaware Statutory Trust, because it gives you the same functionality as a Series LLC, meaning you can create one entity with one bank account, one EIN number, one tax return, one set of accounting books, as long as you track the income and expenses of each property separately. And with that, you get an infinitely scalable company so that you can create basically these sub companies for free, and that each one of those is its own bubble for liability purposes. So if there's ever a lawsuit against one property, they can't go after any other properties, and you didn't have to pay anything extra for that, right? That's just part of the functions of like what a Delaware statutory trust is able to do. And so that's a trust that's formed in Delaware underneath Delaware law. It's like a codified law in Delaware to be able to create that functionality. And then from there, you can use that trust structure anywhere else inside of the United States based upon the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. The laws of one state have to be respected among the several states, and the laws for creating an entity structure is a law of a state. So therefore, we can then use the Delaware Statutory Trust just like major institutional investors use with buying like apartment complexes and parking garages and other types of huge assets.
Sure.
But now the common investors, what I'm recommending, use the Delaware Statutory Trust in California. Because it's a trust, you pay no franchise tax. So you can get all these protections without ever having to pay a franchise tax for your asset.
But don't you still have to register it? Isn't there a registration tax? So you still have to register each entity, right?
If you were going to operate with the entity directly holding the asset in the state and directly in its name, then you'd have to. What we do is we hold all of the assets through common law revocable land trusts. What that does is actually say that the DST isn't directly holding the asset in the state. Actually, this revocable trust is, which has no registration requirement and also allows us to be able to produce anonymity from that. That trust is in turn owned by our DST that's located out of state. So we don't have to pay any foreign entity registration. We also are able to get anonymity inside of the asset holding as well.
Beautiful, man. So that's why people tune into the show for those $1 million nuggets right there, Scott.
Yeah.
All right, man. I was waiting for it. That was the $1 million nugget. I really appreciate that. That was actually pretty awesome. So, man, that is really great. And you know what's really ironic is I've been trying to figure that out for at least 3 years.
Oh, yeah, bud. You should have just came over for a consultation with Spoiler Legal. 30 minutes, you'd have your life straightened out. You wouldn't have to worry about this stuff.
Do you see, man, the power of networking and meeting with smart people, right? Unbelievable. So I really like that. I like that structure using the revocable trust. Okay, now here's a question for the DST. If that is established, would I then be able to receive 1031 exchange money?
Yeah, that's actually the special thing about the DST is you can exchange stock in the DST with 1031 exchange money. Well, unlike what you can't do that with an LLC, right? With the DSTs, you can. So if you're doing fundraising, syndication, other types of work, and you've been looking at additional revenue acquisition, 1031 exchange is a great place for people to be able to come park money. And all you have to do is establish a DST, hold some real estate in the DST, and from there you can exchange stock in and out of the DST.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. Yeah. So you can tell I've been trying to solve that one for a while too. Well, it's been solved on the show.
Yeah. Well, John, you're definitely like on the edge of like, here's some of the more sophisticated things that we do, right? Into there, right? What's really great about I love about my company is that like we help people from all the way from the very beginning stages to like help them grow to be all the way at the place where you're at, which is like, okay, how are we actually maximizing things at a syndication level and like a real business builder, an empire builder kind of level?
Right. I appreciate it. And I have so many friends that would actually like to get into this conversation. So are you familiar with, you have to be with some of the tax advantages by domiciling in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I was just talking about with some friends of mine, we were talking about going down there to look at some of those issues. I don't think I'm going to do it, but I've heard some great things if you're in the right kind of situation.
Yeah, no, the right kind of business, right? And I think there's some opportunities there, especially now to acquire some real estate. And so we're considering some opportunities as well. Well, Scott, I got to tell you, this has been a game-changing conversation. I know for me, and my guess is for literally thousands of others out there. And my hope is that people play this back at least 4 times because there's definitely a couple $1 million worth of nuggets inside of this show. And I've written down at least 4 of them. So as we approach the end of the show, what are some of the things that you see happening right now because of COVID that's making you busier than you normally are or you normally have been? Or some things that maybe have taken away some of the activities that you typically get into? And what is the benefit or the advantage or disadvantage of that to our audience?
Yeah, well, I'd say that like really in real estate, one of the things to always keep in mind is who are the people that are really have like what it is that you're seeking to have, right? Because the goals of like saying like, hey, I just want to be able to create like some cash flow, be able to have some financial freedom is really different than the guys out there that are like saying, hey, I want to have $100 million in real estate in terms of like total real estate portfolio. The guys that I see that do best consistently time over time is that they have a consistent investment strategy or formula that they're using to say, here's the type of deal that I want to get into. And they don't care whether things go up, down, sideways, or whatever. All they care is like, does that deal make sense? And that knowing that they're going to enter into the deal right, and they're just going to hold the deal for as long as they need to, like whether that could be like 7 to 10 years down the line. And those are the types of guys that I see that will, over the long run, have 100% success rate. And so if you're like on that path of like, man, I want to be on the 100% success rate path, that's the path that I've seen over and over again and that I recommend everybody do.
Okay, so let me just comment on that. Okay, so if I heard you correctly, Scott, what you're saying is Market cycle is irrelevant as long as you are really clear about your investment criteria and you stay disciplined to that. Okay. That over time, you're going to create more success than if you started shotgunning it or you start getting nervous when things start to unrattle.
Yeah.
Because usually when
Yeah,
things start to
100%, right?
unrattle is when you have your greatest buying opportunities, right? Like right now.
Yeah, I mean, who cares of like what's going on in the market cycle, right? The only thing that matters is like what's happening with your investment criteria.
Right.
And the key piece to this too is like it's an and statement. Both of these have to be true. One, you have to be clear about criteria. Two, you also have to be willing to hold the property for enough time. And then you don't
Sure.
actually have to care about market cycles at all. Because over time, given enough time, everything in real estate corrects itself, right? Just about everything, right?
Sure.
Not absolutely everything, but anything with like a decent amount of due diligence, it'll correct itself, like given enough time. So as long as you have those two things down, then I'd say just
Or
keep buying assets.
given enough printed money.
Yeah, right. I mean, how many more trillions do you want to put, right? That comes into it. But that's what I'm focused on is, what are the guaranteed ways to pass to wealth? What are the systems, process, the infrastructures that like we see time and time again are the ones that relate to success?
Sure.
Distilling those all down into like a way that's, bite-sized enough for everybody to get like a good feel of like, okay, that's the direction I need to go.
Okay. So Scott, can you share, and then we're going to wrap up the show, a success story? So talk about maybe an investor that you've worked with that you put a structure like this in place and tell the story of what that looked like, what the structure looked like, and what was the success that came from that. And maybe quantify that in dollars, because I think it makes things a lot more tangible when you do that. That way, there we can make this conversation real. We can leave our audience with something tangible to walk away with, and that would be awesome.
So I actually had an investor of mine who ended up flipping a property, ended up having some email exchanges back and forth on the sale of the property about like what plumbing underneath the house had been replaced. As it turns out that there was a leak in the upstairs plumbing of the house after the time of sale, and the buyer wanted to sue, because they're like, hey, you lied to me about the plumbing, and it was, insurance isn't going to cover it, right? Because the allegations are for fraud, because it's in an email exchange, it's communications just like we all do every day. Probably don't think much about them, but that was enough for them to say, hey, we think you defrauded us from it, even though, my client, she didn't intend to do anything wrong, but it doesn't matter, right? So anyway, that lawsuit was for $75,000, and we got it completely dropped because we had it inside of a series LLC structure, right? Which is equivalent in California of the Delaware statutory trust structure. We use it the exact same way. But the key piece to this is that all of her other assets are held anonymous, so they didn't know about any other assets that she owned. And because it was held inside of a series LLC structure, that asset was compartmentalized. So that lawsuit could only go against the entity that sold her the asset, right?
Right.
And sold that to her. And because the asset out of that entity had already been sold, there was nothing left in that entity. So we went to him and I told him, I said, listen, you can sue us all day long. There's actually literally nothing you can get here. Like even in your best case scenario, there's nothing to get. There's that entity doesn't hold any assets anymore. Got nothing there, right? That money. So,
that's an attorney's like worst call, right?
Yeah, it's like you got nothing here. So we got the lawsuit completely dropped.
Like, what?
Yeah, no attorney's fees into it either because she was a family office member. So she had all of her attorney's fees got comped by Royal Legal Solutions for how to negotiate. There.
Oh, that's good, man. That's good. I like
so
that.
Like it didn't cost my client anything. We probably saved her at least $10,000 to $15,000 at a minimum of just attorney's fees. And then we got a $75,000 claim dropped, right? And it was all because she did the proactive steps, right? Being able to set things up correctly and then having us have her back. So that way she always had like a really strong negotiation position and somebody that was really talented on her team to say that, hey, this thing happened. Cool. You kick it over to us. And then we took care of it from there. And we do that actually for all of our clients as part of a membership to the firm.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting? Amazing conversation. Really appreciate the perspective, Scott. This has been really a great show, man. I mean, there have been tons of nuggets inside of this. So I'm going to try to recap the best that I can. Okay. So one of the things that I really like in our initial conversation was your use of estate planning to help create privacy inside of the transactions that we as investors build. But I think more importantly, as we build wealth forward, right? So we can keep that private. Then you pivoted to asset protection and you used a great example with not only your friend, but this as another great example for why asset protection is important. But I really like how you positioned it as a business strategy because it's really not about if, it's when. And the longer you do business, there's some likelihood that you might enter into litigation. And so positioning yourself from a position of strength, right, where you can use your structures to negotiate from a position of strength is, I think, a lot more advantageous than being passive and just letting things come to you. So I think that was a really, really big win. And then lastly, we talked about tax strategy. The comments there is some of the retirement structures that we discussed. We didn't go in depth there, but I understood that. I didn't want to get into a lot of conversation there because I think that your comments around the Delaware Statutory Trust and the revocable trust are going to be a lot more applicable to the audience that listens on the show. And that right there was $1 million nugget. So, man, you get the standing ovation, Scott. Woo!
My man.
Come on, baby.
That's what's up.
Good work, man. Good work. That was a great show, man. I really appreciate you. So, hey, before I ask you to share how people can get in touch with you, this is the question that I always ask our guests, since I've been asking you questions for literally about 40 minutes, is what is the one question that you have of me, Scott, that you think can add some value to our audience?
Well, John, I guess like the biggest thing that I would like to see is like, where do you see with like new people that you're looking to do business with? And in terms of like, where do you see like a common thread of success, or how do you identify a common thread of success to know that you're dealing with a winner?
In terms of what, though? In terms of what? Partnering, for example, on
in terms
a
of partnering
project, or as an investor,
Yeah,
or
so
as
like just say like in the broader scheme of things, right? We always
Right.
think like, hey, we want to do business with people that are winners, right?
right?
And then one of the key pieces I would say is like winners typically leave clues in their past about how to. And then one of the things that I'm always working on is how do I sniff out whether somebody else is really a winner or not? You know,
Oh yeah,
are they
that's a
somebody that
great
usually
question.
finds
I
a way
think,
to win?
yeah, the first
Yeah.
thing is really simple. Do what you say, right? Do what you say. If you're working with someone and they consistently do what they say, and it's problematic to them when they say that they're going to do something and it doesn't happen, that's someone to pay attention to actually work with. Because I've learned that a lot of smart people out there, but there are also a lot of smart people out there that know how to generate wealth. And a lot of it comes down to their willingness to just do what they say, you know? And that's the number one. Number two is resilience. Again, same thing, right? I tell my kids this, in your life, the difference between folks that are super, super talented and those maybe that aren't so talented, but they just are willing to do what's required, okay, are usually going to finish first. And the third thing is learning is a skill. Once I figured that out, okay, it was a game changer for me. Okay, learning is a skill, and you have to be a life learner. You have to be a life learner, and you have to get really good at learning. And when I say learning, meaning not like taking exams, but understanding how to focus on the things that really matter the most that are implementable in business, right? Because you can be amazing at dictating information, but if you can't take out the 1, 2, or 3 nuggets that you can apply, kind of like what we just did on this show, you put yourself in a disadvantage because you pay for a lot of information that you cannot use. And so those would be the things that I've seen over the years and the things that I think have held true for me. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. That helps. I see like the way that you break that down then is you're looking for people that have high levels of integrity. They do what they say and say what they do. And then they're also looking for resiliency of saying, what do you do when you hit some adversity along the way? Are you going to keep pushing? And also tell me about like, how are you learning? Like, how do you actually learn and how do you actually look at new things you're learning about and apply them?
Big time, man. And how do you solve problems, right? Because the reality is no different than what you described earlier, which I think was it's a great way to start a conversation like this, right? It doesn't matter what it is. At some point in your business career, you're going to run into some challenges. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And your ability to solve those problems, I think, is a really big differentiator. And the other thing, too, is, our ability to solve problems, typically our capacity through which we can solve problems will usually run in direct proportion to our income levels, right? The higher or the greater the problem solving abilities that we have, and by the way, that's learned, and we can always increase our capacity to solve problems, our incomes grow in direct proportion to that.
Nice. I like the way you phrase that, John. Your income always grows in proportion to your ability to solve problems.
That's why you got to always be learning, man. Always be learning
I love that.
and increasing our capacity to problem solve or at least identify opportunities. I think they're the same thing. But
yeah, I agree. I think so.
So, hey, bud, hopefully that was helpful. I'm really, really grateful for the question. Really grateful, Scott, to have you on. And this has been really a tremendous show. I'm going to actually go back and listen to this twice because there's some tremendous nuggets in here. And I will reach out to you as well, bud. So how do people get a hold of you, Scott?
Yeah, best thing to do is just go to royallegalsolutions.com. That's what royallegalsolutions.com. And then we have a link up at the top that says get a price or take the quiz. And that quiz really directs us to have the very best information that we need to be able to have like a meaningful conversation and send people the correct materials, to get people jump started. And that's absolutely for free to just make that contact and get that information and get those materials from us. So it's just the royallegalsolutions.com and then click the get a price or take a quiz banner at the top of the page and it'll take you through the quiz there and then we'll connect through that.
Awesome, man. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Can you provide that contact one more time for our audience, Scott, please?
Yeah. It's just royallegalsolutions.com. Go to the homepage and take the quiz that we have. Click the banner at the top that says take a quiz, get a price. That'll bring you to the page that's able to have the best way to be able to start a relationship with us. Let's just go to that royallegalsolutions.com and then click the get a price or take the quiz banner at the top of the page.
Awesome, man. I really like that. Scott, thank you so much for being a guest. I wish you continued success, bud, and keep living big, man. Great show.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Hope you have a great one, amigo.
Thank you, bud. Clarity of purpose creates our greatest competitive advantage. When we transform apartment buildings to thriving communities, we improve how people live and create assets with high profit margins. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this up with a friend. I'm John Brackett, bringing you things you can implement right away.